Hello, friends, and welcome to my course on Carpocrates, Marcellina, and Epiphanes, and specifically how these Carpocratians relate to the famous or infamous secret mark. I'm Dr. David Litwa, a scholar of ancient Mediterranean religions with a focus on early Christianity and Gnosis. I hope you all will grab the textbook for this course, which is my monograph on Carpocrates. It's also available on Audible. Carpocrates was probably born in the late 1st century of the Common Era, about the same time as Marcion. His name means master of the harvest, and it was an epithet or alternative name of the Egyptian god Harpocrates, who was the son of Isis and Osiris. It is a distinctly Egyptian name, indicating Carpocrates' Egyptian cultural heritage. Biographical data on Carpocrates comes from Clement of Alexandria in his book The Stromata, Volume 3. According to this work, Carpocrates had a wife named Alexandria, and he also had a son named Epiphanes, whom he instructed in encyclical and Platonic studies, encyclical studies being the basic subjects like grammar, astronomy, and music. This notice assumes that Carpocrates himself was competent in a range of subjects, including also rhetoric and Platonic philosophy, which assumes a bit of astronomy. The sheer breadth of Carpocrates' education suggests a man of wealth, or at least of middling social status. Clement calls Carpocrates an Alexandrian. He could have come to Alexandria from some other city or town of Egypt, as Valentinus reportedly came from Paralia in the Nile Delta. Epiphanius in the late 4th century says that Carpocrates was a native of Asia Minor, but this detail probably emerges from the heresiological habit of conforming Carpocrates to another early Christian figure from Asia, namely Cerinthus. Eusebius of Caesarea reports that Carpocrates flourished with the Syrian theologian Saturninus and the Alexandrian Basilides. They flourished in the reign of Hadrian, which ran from 117 to 138 of the Common Era. Eusebius's dating may only be based on the fact that Carpocrates follows Saturninus and Basilides in Irenaeus's heresy catalog. A better anchor for dating Carpocrates is Irenaeus's observation that Marcellina, a disciple of Carpocrates, arrived in Rome sometime between 155 and 166 of the Common Era. It's conceivable that Carpocrates flourished between 117 and 166, but we can plausibly narrow his teaching activity to a range of about 135 to 165. This range indicates that if Carpocrates was active during the later reign of Hadrian, most of his career spans the reign of Antoninus Pius, which went from 138 to 161. The first Christian writer to mention Carpocrates was Irenaeus, who sojourned in Rome probably in the late 170s. The Valentinian Heraclian, who was probably also living at Rome at least for a time, noted the Carpocratian practice of tattooing the ear, although he didn't actually call the practice Carpocratian. Celsus mentions so-called Harpocratians and Marcellinians in his book The True Logos, or Teaching. This is reported in Origins Against Celsus, Book 5, Chapter 62, although Celsus could have been writing technically any time between the 160s and the late 170s. It's instructive to look at the placement of Carpocrates in the heresy catalogs that began to pump up in the late 2nd century. On the chart here, I've presented the order of 5 heresy catalogs, beginning with Irenaeus in the left column, followed by the Refutator in the early 3rd century, then Pseudo-Tertullian shortly thereafter, and finally Epiphanius and Philastrius in the late 4th century. So these heresy catalogs span about 200 years. As you can see with Irenaeus, we have a pattern where we go from Simon, who was in Palestine, then Menander, then Saturninus. All of these can be roughly called Syrian. And then we get Basilides the Alexandrian, and Carpocrates, also Alexandrian. And Carpocrates, though, is consistently followed by Cerinthus, who is a theologian associated with Judaism. This pattern or order is basically repeated in later heresy catalogs. I've simplified matters somewhat so that I can fit it to your screen. Probably Irenaeus was dependent on Justin's lost heresy catalog, first written about 145, but it's probably the case that Justin didn't know Carpocrates, and that the entry on Carpocrates was either written by Irenaeus or by an unknown editor who updated Justin's lost heresy catalog, and Irenaeus sprinkled in some more information. At any rate, Carpocrates was placed between figures who reportedly upheld an angelic creation, the Syrian theologians Simon Menander and Saturninus, and he was placed before persons who emphasized that Christ was born like all other humans. And these representatives would include Cerinthus and so-called Ebionites, Christians whom heresy writers considered too Jewish. Carpocrates was said to have maintained both the angelic creation of the world and the idea that Christ was born human. Thus, he is imagined as a bridge straddling a Syrian Gnostic succession, beginning with Simon, and a Jewish Christian succession in Asia Minor. Historically, however, it's misleading to characterize Carpocrates by either of these categories. He really breaks the bounds of the heresy catalogs, and we need to view him afresh as an original and distinctive theologian from Alexandria. We turn now to Carpocrates' teaching and specifically to his theory about God and creation. As I mentioned before, the theory of angelic creation is ascribed to Carpocrates, but I consider it suspect. Other heresiologists who discuss Carpocratian theology, such as Pseudo-Tertullian, Epiphanius, and Philastrius, refer to a single God or principle, a creator and father of all, whom Carpocrates believed in. If he didn't create all things, at least this God and Father would be the source of all things. Of course, the doctrine of a single Father doesn't conflict necessarily with the demiurgic activity of subordinates, whether called angels or powers. We see this in Plato's Timaeus with the young gods and with the powers or helpers mentioned by Philo. Heresiology took offense about Carpocratians portraying Jesus as born by normal human processes. Here it's important to keep in mind, however, that Carpocrates was early enough not to have been influenced by stories of Jesus' virgin birth or conception, which we find in Luke 1-2. Carpocrates seems to have emphasized the divinity of Jesus' soul, which needed no parent but God. It was not as if Jesus was human like the rest of us, that rather the emphasis was that Jesus' soul was divine like the rest of human souls. Jesus was doubtless special, however, in that he was a sage, pure and more righteous than other human souls, and able to remember the heavenly vision of the supercelestial deity. But souls as such were considered to be ontologically equal. Every soul, it seems, had a chance to behold the heavenly vision. And in this respect, Jesus also beheld this vision. He wasn't special in seeing the vision. What gave him his special status was his ability to remember the vision. Carpocratians believed that we should imitate Jesus, who was the only person on record to fully conquer his passions, that is, his wild and unruly negative emotions, fear, jealousy, greed, etc. Carpocratians imitated Jesus, which indicates that they too strove to rid themselves of passions in order to match the righteousness and purity of Jesus. Heresy writers accuse Carpocratians of claiming equality or superiority to Jesus. It's actually unclear in what sense Carpocratian Christians claimed this equality and or superiority. If the report is accepted, their superiority probably meant superiority in works of virtue or perhaps miracles. In making this move, they would have depended on passages such as we find in John chapter 14, verse 12, where Jesus says to his disciples that you will do greater works meaning greater works than his own. And in the Apocryphon of James, Jesus says to his followers, "Become better than I." This is in Nag Hammadi Codex 1. So, with respect to works, one can see the possibility, at least, of superiority to Jesus. Jesus wants his disciples to do better. And with respect to the nature of one's soul, one can also see an emphasis on equality with Jesus. And we find this later with Origen, that all souls, all emanations of God start off equal. But I think that, as in many cases, the heresiologists are exaggerating in order to make Carpocratians seem overtly prideful, as if they all claimed to be better than Jesus in a totalizing sense. I suspect that not many made this claim, if any, and that it was actually a kind of inference based on Carpocratian teaching. Recent scholars, I think, rightly have emphasized Carpocratian's Platonic and Pythagorean heritage. This was his intellectual and spiritual tradition that he emerged out of. And to some extent, this emphasis accords with the heresiological tradition. Irenaeus underscored Carpocrates' doctrine of transmigration, connecting it to a peculiar theory about living every form of life, which would apparently include animal lives. To be sure, one cannot deny that traces of Platonized Pythagoreanism abound in Carpocratian thought. The preexistence of the soul and its descent from the heavenly revolution are distinctly Carpocratian notions, and we can trace them to Platonic ideas, found, for instance, in Plato's Phaedrus. In the second century, it was widely thought that all of Plato's teachings, or at least the best ones, had originally been those of Pythagoras, and that Plato had merely adapted. Pythagoras, in other words, was the great sage, and the same light of wisdom that inhabited him inhabited Plato and inhabited Jesus. Transmigration was a widely known doctrine in antiquity, and it was a teaching promoted by other Christians in Alexandria, among them Basilidaeans, and eventually the Sethians. Carpocratians had their own particular theory of transmigration. They disagreed with Plato, who wrote that a philosopher or a pure soul required at least 3 incarnations to break out of the cycle of transmigration. We see this in the Phaedrus 249a. Carpocratians proposed that one could break out of this system in a single advent, which was a feat accomplished by Jesus himself. The Carpocratian idea of performing every deed has no exact correlate in other Greco-Roman theories of transmigration. Whatever exactly the theory meant, it had nothing to do with sin or performing every type of sin, despite the claims of heresiologists. The Carpocratians were passionate in their imitation of the passionless Jesus. Their understanding of a just, pure, and passionless Jesus, combined with their striving to imitate him, contradicts rumors of their so-called licentious practices. For these practices, heresiologists seem to have had no evidence apart from rumors that were more often spoken against all Christians to reinforce their charges. Carpocratians manifested little interest in Jewish scriptures overall. They were readers, it seems, of Plato and perhaps of Pythagorean lore, but they did not regard these writings as scripture. The only authoritative texts mentioned for them were gospel texts, although Carpocratian gospels seem not to have been identical with what later became canonical texts. Epiphanes alluded to a text in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:45, but his version may not have been from a document called Matthew. Carpocratians may also have appealed to John 1:21 in their support of a doctrine of transmigration. This is the passage in which the people ask John if he is Elijah, that is, Elijah reborn. Carpocratian gospel literature included a parable of Jesus about paying the last penny. It also presented Jesus as offering teaching in private to his disciples with the charge to pass it on to worthy believers. This latter motif is present in many Christian gospels. Unfortunately, the name of the Carpocratian gospel, if it had one, is never supplied. They don't seem to have depended on male apostolic authority, at least. We have no reason, outside of the probably forged epistle to Theodore, to believe that the Carpocratian gospel was a form of Mark. You can see my later videos on Secret Mark. The Carpocratian last penny parable is not Markan, but manifests features from what we know as Matthew and Luke, these waves as we know them. Perhaps Carpocratians were dealing with an earlier text or a harmonized text. Carpocratians are the first known Christians to assert a doctrine of salvation for everybody. This teaching contradicts the still common assumption that for quote unquote Gnostics, salvation was reserved for an intellectual elite. That is not the case here. Marcelinians reportedly called themselves Gnostics. If so, they probably did not intend the term to be their sole and proper name, but advertised themselves as knowers of esoteric lore, a deeper kind of Christian. Anyone could be Gnostic in the second century, and many people claimed that title. Carpocratians, for their part, didn't believe that they were saved by knowledge, but, as they themselves affirmed, by their faith in Jesus, who modeled the path of salvation. They were also saved by their love for God and for one another. In the introduction to my book on Carpocrates, I provide a full history of research on him and on the Carpocratian movement, so go check that out. Generally speaking, you'll find that scholarship prior to the mid 1990s was generally prepared to accept the heresiological portrait of Carpocrates as a licentious Gnostic. Some, like Gershom Scholem, even called him a nihilist, and others even denied his existence outright. Since that time, researchers have devoted more attention to the one sole surviving fragment from a Carpocratian, namely from Epiphanes, as preserved by Clement. Careful study of this fragment corrects the elements of the heresiological portraits and serves as the best starting point for our understanding of Carpocrates and the movements he spawned. Data from the so-called letter to Theodore containing secret mark, I think, should be bracketed in this quest, since this letter was probably forged. As things stand, reliable surveys on Carpocratians are available mostly in other languages. I give you here, for example, Isabella Geraz. If you have a little French, you can check that out. A reliable dictionary entry is by Vinric Lohr in the Gnosis Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. And my book will, of course, provide a full commentary on the earliest sources, mainly in Clement and Irenaeus. Again, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited that you have done so, and I'm very excited for the future of Carpocratian studies, and I hope that you can be a part of it.